Yeah, thanks, Michael. So yeah, I'm Richard Green. I'm a past Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl chair and the regional rep from the Wasatch region to the council at this time. And I'm just going to say a little bit about the history of the bowl and what it is, right? So most of you are either familiar with it, or if you're a newcomer, you've been through the videos and you've sort of seen the nuts and bolts. So I won't go into a lot of detail about things like structure. But if you have questions to that end, we're here all weekend and happy, any of us are happy to answer them. So the Ethics Bowl started in 1993 at the Illinois Institute of Technology. It was founded by Bob Ladenson, who was looking for a nice classroom activity. So he created this thing. Over the years, there's been a lot of rule changes, but it's very much still like the bowl that Bob started. It's called the Ethics Bowl because he was modeling it after the College Bowl. But if anyone is familiar with the College Bowl, you can see that, by the time that Bob had worked it all out, it wasn't much like a quiz show at all, more like a debate type competition. So in 93, it was just a self-contained event at IIT. In 95, he invited some other schools in the Chicago area to participate. In 97, he brought it to API, the Association for Practical and Professional Ethics, and said, hey, can we have it here? The director at that time said, sure, we'll give you some rooms, and, go about it. And Bob started having it there annually. Around this time, a number of regions formed. People were thinking, oh, this is a great activity. I'd like to do it at my school or with schools in my area. Somewhere not too long after this, the National High School Ethics Bowl gets started, along with the Bioethics Bowl, which is an offshoot. There's bowls that don't participate in the Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl, but use the same format. One just for schools in Virginia and so forth. So it's really just growing all over the place, right? There's little bowls everywhere. There's regional bowls. There's this national competition. More teams are wanting to get involved. Um, at I think back in those days there was room for 40 schools at the competition, the national competition at the API conference, and there were suddenly a lot more than 40 schools wanting to participate. So in 2007, we went to qualifying at regional competitions and sending, just the top teams from those regions to participate at the national competition. Through the 20 teens, the bowl grows more. The next maybe notable thing, bless you, is in 2020, something happened. I don't know if anyone remembers it. It was a big thing. Led to the existence of virtual bowls and then ultimately a virtual region. That's, of course, the pandemic. That will be my last attempt at humor this weekend. And now we've come out of the pandemic and we have regional bowls, national bowls, virtual bowls, high school bowls, bioethics bowls, bowls around the country, and ethics bowls have started popping up in prisons. Rachel and I do one in our local prison in Utah. I know Kyle Robertson started, I think, the first prison ethics bowl at San Quentin 5 or 6 years ago, and so forth. So it's really grown quite a bit. What is the Ethics Bowl? Like I mentioned, it's a debate competition, but it's different from other debate competitions in that teams aren't assigned a side, they get to argue for what they believe. And this really points us to what I think is the very best part of the Ethics Bowl. And that's the time the students spend together preparing for the competition, right? It's a rare opportunity that Ethics Bowl students get to learn how to take an extremely deep dive on a compelling moral issue, with fellow students and hash through positions and competing positions and look at different stakeholders and apply different moral theories and do this over, many months to come to a highly refined position that they're willing to take out and, present to other people in the Ethics Bowl competition. So it's a debate competition, but it's really more about becoming, good moral reasoners. as well as, developing critical thinking skills and public speaking skills and teamwork skills and those sorts of things. Um, the other part of the history I just sort of like to highlight, as I mentioned, the rules haven't changed too much over time. When it started, there was, one speaker at, giving the initial presentation for a team. And, so you would be assigned certain cases if you were a participant, and those would be yours. And somewhere around the time of the regional qualifying, we made it the case that the presentations can be the product of all the speakers or several of the speakers on a team. But the thing, in my opinion, that's really changed over the years is the cases have changed quite a bit. And the cases, they tend to involve contemporary moral issues, and those change as time goes on. So, you can look at a particular time, say the start of the pandemic, and see, what were ethics bowlers talking about then, because we had a number of pandemic related cases, or the Black Lives Matter movement and so forth. But when Ethics Bowl first started, there were an awful lot of fictional personal ethics cases, right? It used to be, Ted tells Sally a secret, asked her not to tell anyone. Sally thinks I should honor that request, but at the same time, if I don't tell Helen, some harm might come to her. What do I do? These kinds of things. And now I think that the cases have become really rich, right? That there are fewer of those and more that just reflect the nuance that you see in contemporary moral life. Right? It's tough out there. That, I guess, is my brief history, and maybe I'll turn it over to Deborah and John to talk about the values of the bowl.
Great, thank you, Richard. Deborah, okay, good. We're both here. So I'm John Garcia. I'm another former chair of the Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl, the most recent chair. And Deborah, why don't you introduce yourself and then we'll get rolling.
So I'm Deborah Maurer. I'm a member of the Association for Practical Professional Ethics and a longstanding coach and supporter of the bowl. And so delighted to be here with all of you today to be talking about how we can really support the bowl, the competition, and really build our community. So one of the things that we wanted to spend a bit of time talking about this morning is, given the history of the bowl, what are some of the values? What are some of the goals? In terms of how we engage with each other, what really guides what those interactions look like. And Bob Ladenson has written some really powerful pieces about his vision for the bowl and what he wanted it to accomplish with students. But in the 20 some odd, 25, 30 years since that initial classroom exercise was created, lots of folks in the community have been thinking about the specific values that are inherent in the bowl, both implicitly and explicitly. And when we're thinking about what this means for the values of the bowl, it's not just the people competing in the bowl, it's not just the students, but also the values in the bowl that surround how the coaches interact with each other, how judges interact with the students, how the judges interact with other judges. And so what are the values and goals of the bowl collectively for how all of us interact with each other and what we want to accomplish or see happen at the end of this really transformative educational process. And so one of the values that has been a longstanding tradition within the bowl is really to make it quite welcoming and supportive in a really inclusive environment. We want to bring more people in. We want to hear more perspectives. We want to hear different views and different takes on arguments. And so supporting the most basic value of inclusivity to support a welcoming environment. Also, we really want to support engaged listening. So when we're thinking about having a conversation in this transformative educational activity of the bowl, how do we demonstrate that we're truly listening? Not just pretending to listen, not just taking some notes to get our next, pot shot in the next time we get a chance to speak, but how are we actually listening and attending to and absorbing the arguments, opinions, perspectives, and claims of the other side? And thinking about civility and respect, and not just something which is performative, but genuine. So the people that we're engaging with, whether they're members of the other team, whether they're judges who are asking us really hard questions, whether they're other judges with positions that we disagree with because of their philosophical perspectives, for example, they've got a different perspective and they're bringing a different set of experiences that we really can learn from. So how can we demonstrate respect both for them as an opportunity for learning, and how can we engage in a process of exchange and discussion, which is civil, which allows that learning to come out? And then intellectual humility is an important value of the bull, the assumption that we are all wrong and can be wrong about many different claims and positions and arguments. And so having that attitude of intellectual humility as we approach each argument and each claim that we hear, and also as we reflect on the arguments that we are making, and think about what we've learned and gained as a result of the process. And another important really value of the bowl is authenticity. So it's really easy, because this is a competition, to try to make it look like we're actively listening, or make it look like we're being really civil, or to look like we're being respectful. And then, of course, to make snide looks or snide comments to teammates, or to treat someone with disrespect after a round, or to really say some really cruel things about judges, or for judges to say unfortunate things about competitors. So how can we actually make this competition and discussion in the bowl authentic? So it truly is a conversation where people are learning from the event. It's not about takedowns. It's not about showboating. It's not about opportunities to make others look bad just to score more points, but also to generally engage in moral deliberation in a process where we come away from it at the end having gained through our own authentic participation. And then lastly, learning as an important goal or value. The entire process started, as Richard mentioned, as classroom activity. And so how can we maintain that goal of learning across the entire process?
And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the ways that we try to integrate those values into the bowl itself, and some of the challenges to doing them, making sure that they're integrated. First, just a note, Deborah mentioned this, but just want to make sure to harp on the point. I think a lot of times when we talk about values of the Ethics Bowl, whether you're a coach or an organizer or a judge, we tend to think like, oh, these are values that we want in our students. And it's actually easy to forget that when we talk about values of the Ethics Bowl, we are talking about everyone who's part of the Ethics Bowl community, right? That we all have a shared responsibility for trying to honor and model and inculcate these values in our students, but also sort of be examples of them for the students. And so there's lots of ways that this can, go wrong. And so it's sort of important to always continually remind ourselves that, especially as coaches, that you are in some ways the biggest thing you're doing when you're working with your students is you are a role model to them. But in terms of how we try to implement some of these values, if you think about the structure of the competition, and we're going to see a mock competition here coming up in a minute, right? For instance, when it comes to listening, the initial team gives a presentation, then you have a commentary by the opposing team, and it's not a rebuttal, but a commentary. So it's really, the points themselves are based on demonstrating that you have authentically listened to the presentation of the other team and are responding thoughtfully to it. And if you look carefully at guides to scoring that are, the guide to scoring is available both to teams and judges. And so the teams can see this well in advance, that there are things written into the guide that, like, did you respond in a thoughtful and collegiate manner? And so there are little ways that we try to nudge the students to embody these during the event itself. And one reason for that sort of is a link to thinking about the challenges that come up, right? Is that when you're in the competition itself, it's really easy to sort of like let the competitive juices sort of override some of these other values, right? So you see students who all of a sudden have this adversarialness come out of them in the event itself, where it becomes difficult to honor some of these other values. And so I'm going to talk more specifically about how that shows up in the event itself and what we can do to prevent it here in a second. But before I do that, just a note that along the way of these 2 days, at the end of Saturday, there will be breakout sessions for various topics. And so this is going to be pretty quick. And so I don't think we'll have a lot of time to have questions about what you all think about what are values that you think are part of the bowl that we didn't mention, or what are challenges we didn't mention, or ways to overcome them that didn't mention. So please be thinking about ways that you want to further this conversation as we continue to talk through it. So for those of you familiar with the bowl and familiar with the event itself, there's some things that we see sometimes over the years that we've really tried to encourage teams to avoid. So one issue that we see sometimes is the debate that we have in the ethics bowl community about the role of theory. The thing that we try to caution against, of course, there's a place for ethical theory in ethical deliberation. But what we try to prevent is the idea of name dropping, where you're just trying to dump a bunch of either data or philosophical names or jargon on a team as a way to try to find some term or some philosopher the other team might not be familiar with, and so that it makes you look good and maybe makes them look bad, but hasn't actually forwarded any argument or any understanding at all, right? The one value that's sort of lurking in the shadows of all the values Deborah mentioned is this idea of genuine ethical thoughtfulness and ethical deliberation, where everything that a team is doing is intended to extend and deepen a conversation. And so anything that's antithetical to that is something that we try to discourage. Another example of that is that we went through a patch, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years ago now in the Ethics Bowl, where during commentaries, we saw teams give their commentary, and at the end of their commentary, they would say, like, here are 15 or 16 questions we'd like you to answer in 5 minutes in your response to our commentary. And that's, of course, impossible. And it's sort of a show of bad faith to do something like that. But one thing I think of, and this I think goes back to the role that judges and coaches play in this as well, is that I think judges have a responsibility to decide, okay, they gave, we can't just have a hard rule. You may not ask more than 3 questions. Maybe we could, but whatever. But judges have to determine how many of these questions were really essential. To what degree were these questions really getting at the heart of the issue? To what degree was it fair that they asked them to answer that many? And the other team has an obligation to think about, okay, which of these are actually important to think about? So, often we say things like avoid a question shower to the team, but forget that, like, a coach was responsible for sort of teaching a team to maybe do that. The opposing team has a responsibility. The judges have a responsibility. So it really is a thing where we're all involved in this. In line with the idea of thinking about name dropping, I think one thing that sometimes some people feel is that, when there's a demand that people address a specific moral theory, that might also be sort of like trying to just raise the bar unfairly for students. And so the question always is, like, is this in the spirit of a collegial deliberation, or is it just asking someone to do extra? The final thing I would just talk about is something we've been thinking about a lot in the last 5 or 6 years, which is what issues ought not to be on the table and how to deal with having real exchange of ideas while being mindful of how close to students' identities some of these issues can come, and this idea of that balance between having passion in what you're saying versus letting it become too pitched, right? So we don't want it to be dispassionate, where it's just this cold allocation of things. I had somebody years ago sort of say, like, you're not teaching your students ethics, you're teaching them to be lawyers. And I was like, oh, that hurt a little bit. But I think there is value in learning how to argue systematically and think systematically, but it is important not to forget that we are talking about thinking about things that affect our lives and affect the lives of others. And so we're mindful of this idea of, like, the balance between advocacy which it really isn't an advocacy type event, and deliberative thoughtfulness, which is the space that the Ethics Bowl tries to occupy. With that, I'll try to shut up, but if there are questions or thoughts, we have a couple minutes now, and then otherwise we can save them for Saturday. There we go. Lawyers are great. Thank you. Any quick thoughts or questions from anybody? Otherwise, we could save them. Yeah. All right. Well, we are going to turn it over. Well, we have about 5 minutes, so I don't know. Mark, are you and the students ready if we start in with the mock bowl, or?
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay, so we're going to turn it over to the mock event now. Thanks, everyone.
All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like those who are not a judge and those who are not a team member to turn their video off. So we're only going to be seeing people that are participating. So I'd ask the judges. The judges are Deborah Maurer, John Garcia, and Richard Green. If you could put judge in front of your name. And if Team A could put Team A in front of their name. Team A are going to be responding to the moderator's question. And then the students that are Team B, could you put Team B in front of your name, just so we know who's who, and it's easier to see who's talking each time. Okay, so this is a virtual mock round. So we've set up, Alex Richardson has set up some breakout rooms. And when I send you out to confer, you're going to be put into a breakout room. You'll have 2 minutes. Team A will have 2 minutes to confer. Team B will have 2 minutes to confer for their commentary, and the judges will have 1 minute to confer. We are going to have time markers for you. And Alex has, I don't exactly sure what he's going to do, but he's going to do something with emojis on the screen. So I don't know if you want to show us what you're going to do, Alex, so everybody knows what to look for, like at the 3 minute mark.
There will just be an actual timer on.
Oh,
everybody's
it'll be an
video.
actual
Yeah.
timer. Okay. Oh,
Yes.
that's great. Okay, good. I didn't know what you intended, so that's awesome. All right. So so there won't be any verbal, just the visual time cue, okay? All right. So we're going to do, so I'll ask the question. I'm going to put the question in the chat. So the case for everybody that's
Hey, Mark, do you want to have them introduce themselves as well?
oh, that would be awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you. See, thank you. So how about if the students, first of all, thank you so much for taking time out on a Friday during the summer to hang out with us. So I appreciate that. But maybe, I don't know who wants to start. How about Team A start? Mike, you're the first one on the screen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm always here to give up a Friday. I'm off on Fridays, so that's nice. I am a rising senior at Villanova, and I'm also on the ethics bowl team. I'm involved in the ethics program. I was an ethics fellow and an ethics minor. And I'm studying biology. And I'm originally from Chicago.
Maybe Bodie.
Yeah, hi, I'm Bodie Hayes, a rising senior at DePauw, philosophy major, and a Hillman intern for the Prindle Institute for Ethics. Always happy to be here to help the bowl.
And Samuel.
Hello, I'm Samuel McGuire. I am also from DePauw. I'm a rising senior, a philosophy and classical civilization double major. I'm also affiliated with the Prindle Institute of Ethics. And yes, glad to be here.
Great, thank you. Aiden?
Hello, my name is Aiden Jordan. I actually just graduated high school, but I've been participating in the ethics bowl for about 6 years now. I've been doing it since middle school, and I'm going to Cal Poly SLO in the fall for a philosophy major.
Great, great. And Adam?
Hi, folks. I'm Adam Tatro. I am a master's student in anticipatory intelligence at USU. I am a undergraduate philosophy major. Like I already graduated, and I've done ethics bowl for quite a bit now.
Okay, and there's someone else, right, from USU?
It's
Justin.
Justin.
Hi, I'm Justin Nafziger, and ironically, in the face of my tech issues here with no video, I am a computer science and philosophy double major here at USU. I've been doing ethics bowl for a number of years since Rachel asked me with a couple of days advance lead to jump in and fill a slot on a team. Apparently, I'm a glutton for punishment because I'm also here on my Friday off, but happy to be here. Looking forward to it.
All right, thanks, Justin. Thanks everybody again for being here. So the case we're going to be using, and if one of my team members could find the case, it's at the National High School Ethics Bowl, and maybe post it.
It's there.
Oh, it's there. Good, thank you. So it's the Barnes case, and I'm going to put the question, moderator's question, in the chat. So the teams, you might want to take a picture of this because I'm not sure it shows up in your chat room. Okay, but here's the question. When should a dead person's wishes be overridden in deference to public interest? And please excuse the misspelled word there. When should a dead person's wishes be overridden in deference to public interest? Okay, so we're going to be Alex is going to put you in a breakout room, Team A. You'll have 2 minutes to confer, starting now. This would be the perfect time for dentist office music. Okay, so everybody's back. So Team A, you have 10 minutes to respond to the moderator's question, and there will be a running time on the screen so you know where you are time-wise. At 10 minutes, we'll cut you off mid-sentence, okay? Your time is now.
All right, to begin with some context for the case, in the 1920s, Albert Barnes began his collection from a variety of eras of post-impressionist and modernist art. He assembled this into a gallery in his private home, a very eclectic style, and upon his passing in the 1950s, he created a living trust with the intent to preserve this private gallery for the express purpose of art education. However, in 2004, his living trust decided to, in fact, move this art into a public gallery outside of Philadelphia, creating questions as to whether or not the trust had fulfilled the wishes or had fulfilled the intent behind Albert Barnes' last wishes with his gallery. So in response to the question, when is it acceptable to override the a dead person's wishes in response to public interest, we contend that it is contingent on whether the demands are feasible to meet or are established in a context that no longer holds after the dead person's passing. And with that, we'll present a few arguments to support this point and consider some possible opposing points of view.
Our first argument relates to both the intention of the last wishes of the deceased, as well as the feasibility of their wish themselves. For example, the mission statement of the Barnes Foundation is contingent upon the proliferation of and the advancement of education in regards to the fine arts. And in this situation, in which due to possible financial struggles on the part of the Barnes Foundation, it might become infeasible for that mission statement to be fulfilled at all in the event that, for example, the art is unable to be taken care of, or the facility in which the art is maintained becomes dilapidated or has to be foreclosed. We believe that in this situation, that some of the minutiae of the wishes must be compromised or overridden in order to preserve the crux of the wishes themselves. We believe that this is an important aspect of the wishes of the dead, in that this sort of context in which if the preferred wishes cannot be maintained, we have to see what essential elements of the wishes exist. We believe that the movement of the Barnes Foundation's facilities to Philadelphia represents this sort of aspect. The second argument is in regards to a sort of institutional continuity. We recognize that the dead might make wishes, but that these wishes have a sort of context within their own time and place, and that they cannot feasibly foresee the change in times, the change in financial situations that might await their foundation after their death. We recognize that these wishes cannot last forever, but very wisely, Barnes placed the sort of managerial position or choices in the hands of a select group of board members. And we believe that these board members, at the very least, have some authority to make these changes and make these sort of adaptations to maintain the fundamental interests of Barnes into perpetuity. We believe that as long as they follow within these loose guidelines in which as we said, the essential elements of Barnes' wishes are preserved, that the smaller elements, such as the strict maintenance of these specific guidelines, can be overridden. This is primarily because we believe that these agents have the authority to enact these changes to maintain the interests of the Barnes Foundation. The third argument that we make in regards to the permissibility to move the Barnes Foundation, as well as to overrule the wishes of the dead, is generally one along utility lines. We would argue that in certain situations, the utility of compromising the wishes of the dead can be so great so as to justify slight alterations, if not entirely overruling these wishes per se. For example, in the context of the Barnes Foundation, if we are posed between two outcomes, one in which the art has to be sold off to private collectors or is even irreparably damaged due to a lack of funds in which to maintain the art, that it becomes, and this is contrasted with an opening up the Barnes Foundation, an allowance of a greater audience and a greater access to funding that comes from the transference of this collection from this small, private museum atmosphere to a more open public atmosphere. that the utility that comes from the greater proliferation of access to this art itself, as well as the this proliferation of advancement of education of the arts, which we believe is clearly in line with the essential element of Barnes' wishes, that this movement, as well as this, which seems to be an overruling of the wishes of the dead, becomes ethically permissible. And now we're going to move into some of the counter arguments regarding this case.
Thank you, Samuel. One of the primary counter arguments that we identified as a team in this case was the weight that is given to the will and testament, or the final wishes of the deceased. In our society, we put a lot of weight on those decisions, and for some to go against those wishes, those guidelines, could appear to harm the deceased in a way. But to that, we ask, is there a way to harm the deceased by disregarding the wishes of the dead? That perceived obligation is, for most, seen as a way of honoring the dead, honoring their life's passion and what they worked for. In Barnes's case, he spent his life collecting, appreciating, and opening up his art gallery. And the situation he was in when he passed away, he felt as though his wishes were to keep it a private collection available to art educators and teachers and students. Now, when the financial situations have changed, which, as my teammate Samuel had mentioned, the wishes of Barnes before he died can't possibly have been foreseen back then, right? So these modern financial limitations, his house was in disrepair. The foundation had started to run out of money. They had tried fundraising and weren't able to raise enough money. You were left with the opportunity between having art, having to charge a fee, allowing the public to access it, or having no art at all. And in this case, the perceived harm that could be inflicted upon Barnes, who's been dead for quite a while, is actually non-existent, because his will, his foundation, his trust, the entire point, as Samuel said, was to open up art to the world, to allow people to envision or to visit and look at his art in the way that he set it up. And when the art was moved to Philadelphia, it was recreated in that way. So in this case, if one were to blatantly disregard the wishes of the dead in the matters of how their body is to be interred or how their property is to be split up right away after their death, yes, there could be some harm inflicted. But in the case of Barnes's situation and the situation of the Barnes Foundation, they were left with no other option but to fulfill his foundation's charge to the best of their ability, given the financial situation and resources available to them at the time. With that, I will pass it back to Bodhi.
Yes, in review, we've contended that the wishes of the dead can be overwritten either when these wishes become infeasible to fulfill, or the context changes so that the content of the wishes can no longer be fulfilled. We've used the Barnes case as a bit of example to illustrate when these issues could come about, with the possible damage of art justifying the overriding of possibly the letter of Barnes' wishes to fulfill their spirit and preserve art, even if the context has rendered his original wishes implausible. And with that, I believe we will be done.
Okay, well, thank you very much. All right, so and at this point, well, I'll put the we'll put Team B into a breakout room so you can talk to each other about your commentary. You'll have 2 minutes, and we'll start that right now. That's hysterical. I was actually going to say something, so whoever started that can turn it off. Alex, did you turn that off? I do want to say something. Okay, thank you. That was awesome. I realized that I had not kind of introduced this. We kind of just jumped right into it, and I guess in my head we had talked about this, but that was with the planning group. So for the rest of you, we wanted to give you an opportunity to see the Ethics Bowl in action, and so we're hoping that you've been taking notes and have questions, because what we'd like to do once this mock round is over is open it up for commentary, for questions, for remarks, for observations on any phase of the Ethics Bowl experience, the round, that is, the judging, the commentary, the whatever occurs to you as the students have been doing this. So please be ready to engage in conversation after we're done.
Blah, 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 blah.
John just reminded me, we're only doing half a round, so we're only doing this one case. So the students will offer their commentary, and then the judges will ask questions. And they are back. So, okay. So Team B, you get 5 minutes to offer commentary on Team A's response to the moderator's question, and your 5 minutes begins now.
Hi, Mark. Thanks. I'm going to hand it over to Aiden and Justin. They're going to address the initial commentary that Team A was so gracious to provide us with. And I'm going to hand it over to Aiden. Aiden, you're muted.
Thank you. So first, we want to thank Team A. We thought that they handled the case as well as the question very well, but we had a couple questions for you guys. So this question was really talking about how can public interest overwrite a dead person's promise? And I feel like the second part of this question, talking about the idea of public interest and the value of public interest, wasn't necessarily addressed. So we were discussing, and we think that art in itself has a huge value. And we think that the art allowed, or the art that was owned by Albert Barnes, has a intense historical and cultural value to society because it is very old, because it is very famous. And because of this, we think that that has a massive public interest. And we think that that sort of art, it belongs to the people, and people should be allowed to appreciate that. So how does this interest of art that the public held or holds towards Albert Barnes's collection, when can that interest overwrite a promise to somebody? We don't really think that was necessarily addressed. So if you could please expand on that, that'd be great. And then I'll pass it on to Justin if he has anything else to add.
That was also the core of my considerations. I would say as well, if you find you have the time, expanding on some other instances in which you might find the fulfillment of a promise like that for the dead to be secondary to a broader public interest would also be an area of intrigue. And in interest of time, I want to pass it on to Adam.
Awesome. Hey, thank you, Justin. And additionally, I just wanted to say I really appreciated your presentation, Samuel and Mike. And I wanted to kind of build off of that. I think it's excellent. Samuel kind of brought up that the mission statement of the foundation was kind of at the crux of this. And I think that it would be charitable to kind of point out that he appointed a living trust for a particular reason. Like he could have had all of these minutia details ingrained in a trust specifically without having a living trust. And I think that it's excellent that you guys kind of pointed out that he had that differential where he kind of gave this to the trust. Mike, you brought up the fact that there's this kind of concept of harming the dead. I think I wanted to agree with you, and I think that it's fair and charitable of you to point out that Barnes maybe possibly didn't foresee this in the future, but I also think that it's important that you also, in addition to kind of pointing out that maybe he didn't have that level of foresight. It's also important to point out that Barnes appointed a living trust for a particular reason. And the trust, given their financial constraints and their financial resources, tried their best to see out Barnes's wishes without realizing that obviously his wishes wouldn't have led to the art being displayed in perpetuity. Like, I don't think Barnes wanted that. I think he would have had that if he could. I'm wondering if you also maybe considered some of the kind of financial constraints / incentives in the case study specifically. It kind of mentions how there were some critics that kind of pointed out that maybe there was like a cash, they were trying to cash in on the lucrative opportunity of tourism. Are there considerations for, are the board members getting a share of this money? What are there like perverse financial incentives? Is that in deference to public opinion? Like, while the public is able to access this information, they're able to like perceive art in the context Barnes wanted it. At what context does like the ethical considerations kind of outweigh these financial problems? And if my team wants to add anything, please feel free to. We have 8 seconds left. I exactly. That's what I thought.
All right, we have the sound effects from Dr. Richardson. Okay, so thank you very much, Team B. Now I'm going to put the judges in a timeout. No, put you in a breakout room so you can coordinate your questions. You'll have a minute to do that, and we'll put you in the. Oh, go ahead,
Is we doing a response to the commentary, or are we going straight to the judges?
We're going straight to the judges. That's
Okay.
what I thought. Unless Team A would love to offer a response to commentary.
No, it's okay. Just clarifying.
Team A, are you good?
You guys are the ones that make the schedules, so
Okay.
this
All right.
guys' call.
So judges will put you in breakout. Okay. So just for everybody that's on the call, typically what happens after the commentaries, the other team A gets a chance to respond to the questions raised, for example, for 5 minutes. And so, but in the interest of time, we wanted to give ourselves more opportunity to talk. So instead of making the students go through that. Okay, our judges are back. And we have 10 minutes of Q&A. The judges will ask Team A questions. And we'll have the timer. Alex has the timer going. So, and your time starts now, judges.
Richard, do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so sometimes I like to ask teams a question that presses them on their position. So you're arguing here that public interest and under certain circumstances can override the wishes of dead persons. In this particular case, I want to press you on something implicit in that position, and that is, about the dead person's wishes having some merit, right? And so when you considered arguments from the other team, you conceded the point that, by not honoring a dead person's wishes, that you could actually harm them. I'm coming at this from the complete opposite position. I might be the only person in the Zoom room here that feels this way, but I don't understand why we honor the wishes of the dead. I don't know why, when someone doesn't exist, that their wishes should matter. I don't get wills, I don't get legacies, any of that. So I would like you to give me a moral argument for the part of your case that you seem to acknowledge, which is that there's at least some sort of prima facie value to honoring the wishes of the dead. The dead don't exist. Why do we care, right? We don't honor the wishes of fictional entities. And yet, we can actually benefit the living who do exist. So that's my question. Why?
And thank you for your question. That's a great question. Obviously, the dead no longer exist. There is no way to physically harm them. But the fact of the matter is our society places weight on the wishes of the dead for whether it be social or religious or spiritual or familial. We have this expectation that we ought to honor those that came before us. And in the case of Barnes, we're honoring his legacy in art, the field of art, in the world of his collection, in the world of art education, because the original collection in his house was meant only for educators and students. Now, a compelling moral argument for respecting the wishes of the dead isn't necessarily harm in the truest sense that we would think of it, in the way that if Barnes were still alive and the foundation deemed him mentally incapable of making decisions about his artwork, even though he wasn't, that would be a physical harm brought about against Barnes. But the fact of the matter is even if one, which you disagree with, you're saying that the dead cannot be harmed. Even if one could harm the dead, Barnes wouldn't have been harmed in this case, was what we were arguing. I think I can clarify that a little bit here. Because the mission statement of the foundation was still, they're trying to fulfill that to the best of their ability. To me and to us on Team A, we don't see that as harm at all. So we don't necessarily hold that the dead can be harmed, period, but that in this case, Barnes isn't being harmed at all. So the argument is really irrelevant. That was kind of a counter argument to bring up what some might argue against our point.
Also,
Yeah, just brief follow-up. So no, I get how your argument functions.
We'd also, sorry. We'd also like to point out.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say we'd also like to point out that the societal standard does have some degree of utility, and that we would argue that this general expectation that we do honor the wishes of the dead to some degree does prevent emotional suffering, etc., among the living. For example, people would behave differently if there was the expectation that once you pass, your memory would be desecrated, your body would be thrown to the dogs, etc. That would create a great deal of psychological pain and suffering that we seek to mitigate by still maintaining the wishes of the dead to the degree that we can, or to the degree that is feasible. Not outright completely saying that we should disrespect and commit sacrilege on the memory of the dead and their wishes, but rather this sort of like medium position in which we have to weigh the feasibility and the utility of actually carrying out those wishes, and comparing them to the alternative, which is to either like undermine or to transform their wishes, which is what the Barnes Foundation is doing by transferring their location.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'll pass it on to John or Deborah.
So thanks for the really fantastic presentations of both teams. I want to press a little bit on some of the claims about what the foundation is doing. So we often have limits on representation, who can represent. We also have limitations on what representatives can do. Both for guardians and executors, wills often specify precisely what they can do with their powers. But also we might think about the Constitution as presenting these same kinds of limits on future generations or representatives for what they can and cannot do. So I'd like you to explain a little bit more to me using something like the Constitution as a model, which is presenting limits of process, limits of goal, limits of spirit, and the maintenance of the institution across time, what moral limits do you see that the members of the board should have in trying to maintain Barnes's wishes?
Well, I believe, as we've kind of contended throughout our presentation, these moral limits, when contexts begin to change, are mainly found at the spirit of the wishes rather than necessarily the letter of them. Given the foundation had a choice between, or the trust, excuse me, had a choice between letting the private collection fall into disrepair or making this move to public galleries, we think that in very specific context, it becomes necessary to seemingly violate those wishes for the greater goal that they believe Barnes would have wanted.
So just as a quick follow-up, so you don't see there as being a limit?
Well, we do. I mean, obviously, the trust could not make some kind of move to destroy the art or, sell it or just something that would completely devalue it or completely disobey Barnes' wishes. But we think they are broader than his specific wording on what should be done with the art.
Okay, John?
The other two judges each took a strand of thought that I wanted to push on. So I want to focus on part of your argument that's about, oh, they're sort of honoring the spirit of it. And, he had a trust for a reason. And, he does say that he was very opposed to commercialization of the artwork, that he thought seeing it in his own home was the only way to enjoy the educational experience. They were guided tours of the home that were for small groups. So, how would you respond to the challenge that this is more than not honoring the letter of his wishes, that it really is a fundamental shift in the spirit of his wishes?
I mean, obviously, there is a change in what relative to exactly what Barnes wanted to be done with his art. But I don't know if I would go so far as to say it's a different spirit. The new location of the Barnes collection is a near exact replica of the interior of his house, set up exactly how he had set up the art, based on landscape, color, theme, as opposed to time period or artist. And obviously, Barnes being against the commercialization of art, there seems to be some tension there between that personal feeling and now the fact that they're opening up the gallery to the public and charging an entrance fee. But again, I think it all comes back to the foundation was out of money. They had no other opportunities to pursue other than allowing the public to view the art, charging an admissions fee, and using that money to preserve it. It's unfortunate that Barnes's foundation wasn't able to fulfill his wishes perpetually, as he set it out, but we hold that they're trying to fulfill it as able to in the modern age, as opposed to when Barnes had originally passed.
I'll spare you a follow-up since there's 10 seconds left.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, judges, and thank you, Team A and Team B for helping us out here. I'm going to own up to the fact that I blew it here. I should have had you respond to commentary. I'm doing an exercise in my classroom, and I think that had that at the top of my head, and so I got confused. So I apologize, especially to those of you who have never seen an actual round. Should have been at least half of a round, and we did a 3/4 of a round. So, but I think I hope you got a sense, if you've never seen one of these before, that the cases, this is a typical case. It invites students to do a little bit of research. They don't have to, but they like who's Barnes. Especially if you're not from Philadelphia, I'm from Philadelphia, so I know who Barnes is. You might want to do some research about this character. But you notice the moderator's question expanded it far beyond the Barnes Foundation. The Barnes Foundation becomes a case to explore this kind of an issue, and I really like the way Team A immediately made that point, that this is a case about a more general point that they wanted to make an argument about. And that is not atypical. That's a pretty insightful move for teams to move away from the specifics of the case, unless those specifics are relevant to some more general point that they want to make. It's also important to answer the question, and Team A answered the question. Some teams come in with they're ready to talk about the case, and then they forget to answer the question, which is not a good thing. The commentary that Team B offered, I'm making some general comments and hopefully prime the pump for a nice conversation. The response or the commentary on the case, I love the fact that you started with some main questions, and then you got more into your own deeper analysis of particular points. Because first of all, you get what I liked about that is it got out right away for the team that would have to respond to those questions what you're most concerned about. I took that to be the point of starting with those questions, and the most pertinent questions that need to be addressed. But then you went in and talked about your own insights that you had about the case that weren't quite developed by Team A, not necessarily against what Team A was doing, but complemented what they were doing. And then my last comment about the judges' questions, each one of them did something that's pretty common for judges, which is to find a way to get the student to think deeper about the case, expand their own thinking, push them a little bit. And that's typically what happens when a team does a really good job, which I think Team A did. So the judges then took that as the liberty to push you in directions that they thought would be an opportunity for you to show the depth of your understanding of the issues at play here. If your presentation hadn't been that strong, then typically judges will ask questions to help you clarify more what might not have been so clear in the argument in the first place. Again, remember the goal here, and then both teams demonstrated this, as did the judges. I hope people had a richer appreciation for the kinds of issues that are demonstrated in this case, that these are applicable to lots of other kinds of situations, not necessarily in a uniform way, but the values and the interests that were being articulated here are much more general than what might be in the case itself. And I think that's what's valuable about this. So I hope we all ended that 25 minutes or so smarter about this than we were when we began. So those are my general reflections. I'd love we have about 25 minutes left in this session. I would love, we had some questions already in the chat. So if you didn't get the chance to look at them, I appreciate my other team members responding to those questions already. There's also some links to some important information if that would be helpful to you, especially if you're new to this. The floor is open.
Would it be helpful to people if each of the judges, if we said a word or two about things we noticed, or do you want to just jump in with questions and thoughts from what you saw? We can do whatever works for people.
Why don't you go ahead and give some
why don't you go ahead?
commentary?
Yeah. Okay. I'll just give a quick thought or two. One thing I thought was smart by Team A is that you laid out these principles right up front about how you thought to handle this case. And one of them was the sort of feasibility of honoring the commitment. And I mentioned this because I like, otherwise I would have found your response, I'd say this like with love and jokingly, annoying. And I don't mean that literally, but what I mean in more seriousness is that as a judge, what I look for is I don't like it when teams sort of like try to avoid what I take to be the ethical heart of the case. you know, and so I think of the ethical heart of the case here is like this tension between public interest and exploring that, right? And so team A was like, well, they couldn't help it. They were going broke. And then I was like, well, that's not fun. But you did a really good job, you know, saying like, look, there is a practical reality here. And so we have to understand that they need to navigate this reality. And then I thought it was really good that you didn't base your whole case in that you allowed it to open up to some of those more theoretical points about harming the dead, things like that. And you know, I think I'm hoping as an audience members, you can appreciate where you could have seen this discussion going, that like we could have had more discussion about like, okay, if it's not about harm to the dead, what is the basis for the obligations to the dead? You know, is it about sort of an idea of virtue that we sort of owe it to ourselves to have a kind of respect for them? Or is it this sort of Kantian notion of promise keeping, things like that? And one difference for those of you coming in between, I think, what we just saw and what you might see in late November is that the teams will have been working on these cases for 8 weeks in November, where we have a very nice set of volunteers who, you know, agreed to do this a couple of weeks ago and got together, and a lot of them aren't even from the same institution. So really thought it was a great job from all of you. And I'm hoping the audience can sort of see different places where the conversation could have gone that could have been sort of alternative ways of thinking about it.
So I just want to say this partial round that we just saw models really nicely the kind of conversation that we hope to see in the Ethics Bowl and the exploration of ideas as ideas are traced. And so Team A did a really nice job of laying out in a clear and systematic way what the argument was. And think of this almost as approaching charity and empathy for one's listener. It's really hard to just listen to an idea or a batch of arguments as opposed to reading them and having more time to sit and absorb. And so as an act of charity for your listeners, when you're presenting an argument, giving points, right? Numbered points, principles, and now our first argument, our second argument, that kind of signposting is incredibly helpful and thoughtful for both the other team and the judges in tracking an argument and understanding how it systematically follows the claims being made and then how the team is deriving their conclusion and making their case. So they did that really well. And it's one of the things that is on the score sheet, but also one of the values of the bowl. It helps us understand and comprehend the position that other people are coming from and the judgments that they're making about a particular case. And I thought our Team B did a really nice job, again, in continuing some of the values of the bowl in identifying what they saw as the core ethical issues, but also saying, we'd like to press you a little bit more. We agree on some of these core values, but have you considered some of these financial considerations? And what do you do? And how can we try to think about whether or not the board is getting money? Right. And so what happens in judges' questions is that we'll often listen to the arguments presented by both teams and look for places to press further, especially if it was a concern we already had, right, where we can drill down a little bit more. And something else that judges often do, as Mark already mentioned, is we'll present contrasting cases or additional examples designed to try to press you well beyond the case to see if your reasoning would be consistent across other cases, or in this particular example, if there are resources that you might think of by considering another example that you didn't bring into the argument that you could as part of your response. So by giving you an example of the Constitution and the idea that it's not just the spirit that we attend to there, it's also the maintenance of the institution, right? The government itself over time, how it functions, process. We had already heard some concerns about financial constraints and limitations. And so one of the things as a judge that I'm looking to see is how quickly teams are absorbing and really engaged in the full conversation by being able to expand the case that they made. So what sorts of limits should be in place? Should there be any kind of financial limitation or conflict of interest, right? Should there be a prohibition on a benefit? Should there be a prohibition on the board members being involved in any of the other companies, businesses, or nonprofits that support the downtown that might receive benefit from this? Are there ways that we could meet some of those concerns? What would those limits be? And then what would be a moral reason for imposing one particular limit rather than others? So I'm always looking at a judge for how students can extend their reasoning, how they can make use of other cases to demonstrate how well they understand the questions, how well they've integrated comments and concerns from the team that gives the commentary, and then also how well they are applying the arguments that they're making in terms of practice. So it's really easy for teams to come in and make moral arguments that sound really grandiose, but in terms of application, they just don't work well in practice. So again, it's one reason why I always try to give questions using examples, like we have lots of executors in wills, and those are specified limits really finely. And so how can students make use of those concrete other examples to help build their cases, again, as part of a continuation of the conversation that judges are having with the teams as part of pressing them. And one other thing to mention quickly, just for folks who are new to the bowl, if this is the very first time you've ever seen a partial round, it's always permissible for judges to ask one follow-up question, and they'll do so because they want to just push a little bit more on one point or push for an additional explanation. And so that wasn't an attempt to try to do a comeuppance. Again, the goal is to try to deepen the conversation, deepen understanding in the conversation itself.
Okay, so let me just say a couple of things. Maybe I'll start with the follow-up question. I had a number of follow-up questions, and I chose not to ask one because I was watching the clock. And by the time Team A had finished answering my question, we'd used more than half of the judge's time. So I'm starting with something negative here, but this is a really minor point, but worth keeping in mind that I have positive things to say as well. So my advice is, pay very careful attention to the amount of time you're spending on any particular judge's question, because if there's not enough time for the other judges, right? And just sort of think of it, as a third of 10 minutes, right? 3 minutes, 33 seconds, and so forth. If you get to judge 3 and you've spent all your time asking or answering questions of judge 1 and 2, there might be a question there that's lingering in the mind of that judge where perhaps you could have answered it and, strengthened your case in the mind of all the judges, right? So in short, you may be leaving points on the table, if you don't get to each judge's question, right? If they have concerns and you're not allowed to fix it up, then it's still there. So question management is mostly the team's responsibility, unless the judge is really long-winded and they spend 2 or 3 minutes asking the question. And that sometimes happens. And when it does, I think it's unfortunate. So I thought you guys gave a great response to my question. I had at least 5 follow-up questions, which to me indicates that your response was very good. I was fully engaged in that conversation at that moment. And if we had just been talking, or if we're in my classroom or something, I would just be off to the races in my happy place as a teacher. Oh man, we could talk about this all day. And that's a really good sign. If you get me that excited as a judge in responding to my question, I'm going to give that high marks, even if the content isn't exactly what I would want to hear. So just John and Deborah have said a lot of the things I want to say, but I'll point out a couple of things. Both teams were really clear in their presentation, really well organized. Great listening going on. I'm sure if we had done a response to commentary, that would have bore out for Team A, but it did bear out in response to the judges' questions. I felt like you heard the heart of the questions and were engaging them earnestly, and it was clear you had sort of heard the nuance in the case. Team B, that was a great job of listening to what Team A said and responding to the particulars of it. So it was nice. One other advice, Team A, I would like to have seen a little bit more of a moral argument, right? At some point you appealed to utility. You said there'd be super great utility under certain circumstances. I think whenever you bring a consequentialist argument into it, you have to say a little bit about utility all the way around, right? Is the utility, when the utility is great, then we can clearly do this. What about when it's mixed and so forth? Do we need to do some sort of consequentialist or utilitarian calculus. So yeah, maybe just a little bit more time spent, on that bit of the moral theory. Otherwise, really good. I want to just give you something to think about in response to my question. So if we honor the wishes of the dead as a society, why do we feel it's okay to kill zombies? I'm just saying it's seems inconsistent. And I'll pass it back to Mark with that thought.
There's a thought-provoking question. All right, thank you, judges. I wonder if the students have anything they want to weigh in on in their experience of crafting their analyses on not just this case, but any of the cases they've done in the past that might be helpful for people to hear who might be new to this.
Otherwise, there were a few comments in the chat as we were,
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
I mean, I guess I can talk about that a little bit. A lot of it, for at least for us at Villanova, is just working through the cases together as a team. I think most of us, all of us will say it's just a lot of fun, and that's what kind of gets you into it, right? Enjoying working through the cases, particularly harder ones, with your teammates, is what keeps you engaged and keeps you wanting to formulate stronger arguments, really hammer down that case, get it to where you want to be. And unfortunately, the night before the competition, I think every team is always scrambling for some reason, but we like to think that it's all about working together as a team and just fully fleshing out all the cases. I think the biggest thing, Rich, you made a great point about the judges' questions. I was definitely the one that was long-winded. Sorry about that. But time management as a team is a big one. I know a lot of teams bring timers, or teammates will, I'm always wearing a watch just to keep track of time. I think that's a big one for the team members, at least, is your time management, your ability to organize your argument and keep everything flowing.
Thanks, Mike. Justin?
I think one of the things that I've encountered most in prepping for Ethics Bowl, and kind of a useful element of being involved in Ethics Bowl, is really fleshing out the inflection points in any given case between ideal and non-ideal theories. Because there's definitely a, like, this is the goal or the guiding star of where we want to be ethically, but there are always material questions as well. And it's helped me bring that to the forefront, where I can say, this is our ethical theory, this is what we may be seeking or would like to have. Also, here are tangible concerns that we have to grapple with if we want to make this a real world ethics case in any way, and trying to figure out where those two meet or where they come apart, and hopefully discuss that in the round.
Good, thank you. By the way, if you want to see at least one response to the zombie question, check the chat. Unless Bracken wants to bring it out into the open.
I will happily do so. Yeah, I was trying to do an indent to continue on with it, but then it just sent the first paragraph. Okay. So zombies, they used to be humans, so they had their own intentions in life, such as not having their bodies destroyed by like a baseball bat or a gun. Usually it's like the entire brain needs to be destroyed for them to die, which is definitely not something they'd like in life, at least. But when it comes to them being in death, their bodies are actively causing harm to others or intend to cause harm to others. Though it's less the intention and more the potential of harm, such as if someone has a highly infectious disease and then they die in a public area, their body needs to be disposed of regardless of their intentions, because of the harm it can cause to others in life. Intention of people in life tends to go away once their intentions seek to harm others, and they should be ignored if their intentions would harm others, whether they intended to harm others or not.
Okay.
By those lights, then we can also kill Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, because they're harming others too.
I would argue against that in that in the case of we're talking about dead people and those people are still alive, and I wasn't arguing for a case of killing living people. In the case of zombies, they are undead. They've already been killed and they no longer have consciousness. They are rather just walking corpses. As for people causing harm, it's harder to argue that Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos are directly killing people in the case of zombies that are eating other people alive, or a dead body with an infectious disease that is actively infecting others and spreading whatever disease is present in the body.
I'm gonna
I was just about to
Go
do that. Yeah, I was just about to do that. So that enough for the zombies. But thank you, Bracken, for responding to the question. I want to go. There's a couple. I just want to highlight a couple things that are in the chat. So one of the questions Nathan asked about judges: do judges pay attention to how a team works together? Now, John has already given you a one response. The only thing I just echo this idea that it doesn't matter how many people speak as long as the whole thing is coherent. So you could imagine a situation where people don't have their act together and they pass the baton, as it were, and at the end of it, you have no idea what they think. Well, that's a bad presentation. But you could also have everybody speaking and it's crystal clear. So the focus is not on how it's presented, it's on the content. And if how it's presented affects the content, well, then there you go. There was another question here.
Mark, while you're looking, can I just sort of add to that? There are times where I've seen judges sort of value teams that work together better than ones where it's an individual person. Normally that shouldn't be the case, right? And we sort of admonish against it. But there's this sort of practical thing where teams that work really well together in the same way that, people who are very good public speakers might get rewarded. Probably shouldn't be that way, but it at least sometimes is.
I'll use this as a quick moment to plug something that we mentioned in the values discussion, which is Richard, and a lot of the people that are organizing this have done a lot of work in the judge training, and we hear a lot of people talk about issues they have with judging because they worry about things like this. Oh, I felt like the judges over awarded them for blah, blah, blah. And I really think that this is a time to reflect as coaches about trying to talk to your students along the way about, not worrying so much about, what might be the unconscious messages in the judge's head, and just trying to get them to not worry so much about these different things, because they can't be helped. Ultimately, there is this subjective element of the competition that would be a shame to remove totally. So just a quick thought on that. Mark, you had something in there about the legal thing, not Mark Dorley.
Yeah, I was going to come. That's what I was going to come to. So this distinction between what's legal and what's moral can oftentimes come up in cases like this one. There's legal dimensions to the Barnes case, and those can be incredibly illuminating, not because they're legal cases, but because the argument underlying the legal position, right? So if the judge denies a motion to stop the movement of the barns, that judge is going to give some kind of argument. And sometimes within those, many times in legal arguments, there are moral principles at play, not just legal principles. So I always encourage my students, if they want to look at the legal dimensions of a case, we have a history in this country of things that were legal that were clearly immoral. And sometimes there are things that are legal that may be immoral. The other way around, that are illegal but are moral. So it's helpful. The students, this is an ethics bowl. It's not a legal bowl. So we're really interested in the ethical principles that are at play in these various things. So if the law is brought in and how the law has decided some issues. So for example, the affirmative action ruling a couple summers ago. there were clear moral principles at play in that decision by the Supreme Court. And so those are legitimate things to bring into the conversation, whether or not we necessarily agree with the argument. The principles are there to be discussed. So, I mean, that's what I do with my students. I always push them, okay, what are the moral principles at stake here? And if it's a purely legal point, well, then it's not going to be helpful to advancing this conversation. So anybody want to jump in?
I'll just say two quick things. One about what Mark Dorley was just talking about, and one about the things popping up in the chat. The other thing I think is interesting about looking at legal arguments is they often use a lot of analogical reasoning. And I find thinking by analogy to be very helpful in the bowl. And that was a place, if we had time, I would have asked more about in the judge's Q&A for this. To the things coming up in the chat about diversity of teams. I mean, this is something that we really want in every aspect of everything we do in the Ethics Bowl to try to encourage. And any advice people have of ways that we can encourage it organizationally, we want to, but absolutely for coaches, it only makes teams better to have a diversity of representation and diversity of viewpoints. And for in its most basic level, you're taking a position, but you have to be aware of counter arguments. So having a lot of diversity of thought on the team is really helpful. And Glenn, you mentioned an aspect that we didn't get to in the discussion about that. And I said this earlier in the chat that I think like the best matches are matches in which everybody leaves the room wanting to talk for another half hour about the case, because there's always these elements you can get further into. So yeah, it was a super great point that you brought up.
Rachel?
I just wanted to say something about, our wonderful participants today. It kind of came from us trying to find people who are available. So I think that and we found some great ones, but often the teams are more diverse than this. We just happen to not display so much diversity today, but it is something that I think all of us think is important.
We have 1 minute left. Any last minute comment or question from anybody before I wrap us up? Okay, so we hope, especially if you're new, you got a sense of how the students engage in the discussion in an ethics bowl, in a round. And I did, the judges didn't give them a score, but I think you got a sense from their comments that what they might have scored them. And we shared the score sheet with you in the chat. So if you didn't get that, you might want to look through the chat again. But we appreciate everybody's feedback, and we look forward to continuing our conversation this weekend.
All right. And with that said, we're going to take a 15-minute break. So we're going to come back at 10:45 Pacific time, and that's 1:45 Eastern time. So for the next session, you actually have a choice. So we're going to do a session concurrently. One on how to use the ethics bowl in the classroom. That's going to be facilitated by Rachel Robinson Green and Alex Richardson. And then we'll have another concurrent session on coaching the ethics bowl. And that'll be facilitated by myself, John Garcia, and Richard Green. So we'll take a 15-minute break. So we'll see you guys back in about 15 minutes.
All right.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks so much.